Welcome back, Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. It's great to see you again. This is going to be another mini episode. Sorry, I haven't put out one for a little bit. I haven't found one that I felt was really good to put into a mini episode where I had something really solid to put into one. Plus, as you know, I haven't been able to put out as many videos. So, anyway, this mini episode is going to be on setting from our class that we had fully on setting. I think I'm going to discuss the different elements that go into a setting and how they relate to setting and what's important about them. Again, as I mentioned in the class, these different elements and things like that I'm talking about that relate to setting and are important to discuss in setting and to know and to have in setting and relate to setting. Those things will come in more videos, more in depth, so go ahead and look forward to that. So just for now, I hope that you enjoy this mini episode and the things that are involved in setting. Alright, let's get started. We're going to go ahead and move on to what is involved in setting for fantasy. This is going to be an overarching kind of deal here. It's going to be what all settings, at least for fantasy, is usually going to need. Alright, so sorry if I'm constantly looking down. I'm kind of looking at my trusty dusty notes here and making sure I cover everything and know exactly what I want to say with each item. So, again, I'm going to say that these elements are going to be very broad, and I'm going to talk about how they relate to setting and why they're important to setting, but I'm not going to go really in-depth, super in-depth on each topic and really explain the specifics on everything. That can be in later videos. Right now we're just going to see what the elements are and how they relate to setting and why they are important to setting. So if you have any questions about anything particular, you can either wait for a future video or you're welcome to comment below, and I'm welcome to explain a little bit more about each of the individual items that I'm going to be listing. So for this discussion as well, we need to define that setting is both the small places that each character will individually interact with when they go there. For example, like a village or a town or a city, depending on what type of story you're creating. As well as the big overarching world. So Earth is your setting, or a fantasy world that you created yourself. And whatever the name of that world might be, the whole overarching world is setting, as well as the fountain that you go to, your characters go to for whatever reason, or the town that they pass through, or the forest that they're in, or Chicago, or Las Vegas, or whatever else that the characters live in or encounter or go through or whatever else. So setting is both very broad and very small in this discussion. You need to keep both in mind, and that's what this list is coming from, is having some things that relate to the whole world and some things that relate to very specific elements of this world. Okay, so the first one is going to be the obvious. Setting is the environment. So that's pretty much what most people think of when they think of setting, is where they're at specifically in that moment. So, for example, if you're in a fantasy world and you're in a forest, that's your setting, and you have your environment is the trees and the dirt and the clearing or whatever else that you have going on with this forest. If your setting is Chicago, it's going to be the skyscrapers and the roads with the small parks in the city, or the museums, or whatever else. Those are your setting and environment around you. Or say you're doing a fantasy world and you're in a castle, so then you're going to have the thrones and the tapestries and the big windows and the really tall towers that the princesses are locked up in. Or whatever else. So the setting is the environment, the buildings, the flora and fauna, the actual environment that you're in that will need to be described, especially if you're in a high fantasy realm where it's not what we would expect as a dweller of Earth, or it's going to be describing the differences between what we would expect in our real world and what actually is, as well as describing it just that way we know where we're at. If you're in a building, there are plenty of different types of buildings you could be in, and so you do have to describe exactly. Even though we know what a building is, we don't know what kind of building your character's in. So you do really have to build the environment. You have to build where they're at and what they can do at this place. So that is why environment is especially important when we're discussing setting and we're writing setting, is because setting really defines what a character can do. If they're in a forest, and say this is even in an urban fantasy, if there's no cell towers, they can't call for help on their phone. Or if they're in a high fantasy and they're in a forest, they're obviously most likely not going to use magic that's going to be fireballs unless you're a Fizbin and don't care if you light everything on fire, because you would light everything on fire and kill yourself. So your environment really affects what the characters can and cannot do, or where they're at, or what is realistic, things like that. So the environment is really good to establish, really important to establish and to explain and to describe enough for the reader to understand where they're at, know what's important about where they're at, and can then understand the limitations of what they can and cannot do at this location. So environment is very, very important to the setting. Of course, in later videos, we will go ahead and talk about creating certain environments and those kind of things, but for now, let's go ahead and move on. Next is going to be creatures/monsters. So this is important for both kinds of stories, but especially true of high fantasy, because high fantasy is a world that's not Earth, and so they have creatures and pets and things and monsters and whatever else that do not exist in Earth. So you really do have to, in order to build your world and to make it what it is, you're going to have creatures and monsters and pets and those kind of things, and animals and whatever else. So it is really important to create a world and to create a setting is to have these in them. But it's also important for an urban fantasy, because even though we know like the normal things about dogs and cats and lions and tigers and bears, oh my, it's important that the fantasy elements that are involved might involve creatures that do not normally exist in this world. And so any of those creatures are going to be brought in and are going to need to be explained and are important to the environment and the setting, because this is not Earth officially. When it's an urban fantasy, it's going to be Earth with fantasy elements in it, which means that the setting is actually different and is required to have these creatures in order to be the setting that you are in. Does that make any sense? I feel like it makes sense in my brain, and then I'm trying to say it and it's not coming out as good as it could. So please let me know on this topic, especially if you have any questions. But yeah, so that's why I'm talking about this for setting, is because settings have some kind of creatures or animals or whatever else that are in the setting. This is a world, big world setting view, is the creatures that are in it define what the setting is. Just like, for example, if you go to the savannah in real life, you're going to have different animals than if you go to the Arctic. So the setting is made up, and if it's affected by what creatures live there. What do you have to look out for when you go there? So even in real life, if we're going to make it an example, is that the setting is linked to the creatures that can live there and can be there, and part of the setting is the creatures and the animals that live there. If that makes any sense. I think that came out a little bit better. Let me know. Okay, so we've established that. The next one is places. So this is going to be kind of a mixture between the whole world view and the small setting wise, because you need places in order for things to happen. So this is kind of like a whole, like I mentioned, the whole point of setting, but it's important for places in a setting for things to happen, obviously, but also because places are different depending on where you're at. So going back to my example of the Savannah versus the Arctic, the Savannah is a very different place than the Arctic. The Arctic is cold and snowy, and it's got ice and glaciers, and we've got all the other elements that are there, versus the Savannah, where it's hot and it's deserty, and we don't really want to be there because there's nothing there. Or maybe grasslands in certain parts of the Savannah. So going to different places, or even to different cities, or to different anything, like down the street or whatever, is going to be a different thing. So depending on how far you go is going to depend on how different the places are, but every place is different. So it's very important to establish what kind of place this is, what kind of desert this is, what kind of Arctic this is, what kind of anything this is. Is it a small town? Is it a huge city? Are we in the wilderness? Are we in a grasslands? Where are we? So the places are important. The very specific places that your characters are going to go and interact with is very, very important to be clear about and to establish. Okay, next thing is things. Now you're probably like, how do things relate to setting? Things relate to setting because you have different things in different places, because of different cultures, because of different materials, because of different things that are affected by settings. So to create this setting, to create this place, you have people that live in that place, and you have people that have things. So because you have people that have things, and you have different areas or whatever, so in different cultures, they're going to have different things in that place. So to establish the setting, it is very important to also think about the kinds of things that would be in this place. Depending on if, say, they are a cold weather place or whatever, they're going to have a lot more jackets, they're going to have more furs, they're going to have more things to keep warm. The things that they might have or might be made more out of the materials that they have with them. So maybe they don't have tons of trees and things like that up there, so they don't have many things that are made out of wood, and the wood they save is for building fires and creating warmth. Or maybe they live in a desert, and the things that they have are all about finding their way in the desert in case you get lost. So they have bunches of compasses, or maybe they have a bunch of solar powered stuff because they always have the sun, or whatever else. Or maybe it's gonna have a fantasy realm that has things like elves, and they live in the woods like a typical woodland elf. And so they have tons of trees, and so they build their trees, their houses in trees, or whatever else. Their things are going to reflect the place that you're in. So a setting is important to have things, because there is things are part of are defined by where you're at. And along with things, we have people. Because like I said, you can't have things without the people. So setting is very important because you have to have people in them. People help define the setting. If you live in one place, it's going to be different. People are going to be different there than they are in the other place. Like I said, because of culture and because of environment. The setting is affected by the people that are there. For example, if you go to Mexico, it's a way different set of people than if you go to China. So people also make up the setting, which you're probably thinking like, that's ridiculous, like these are all separate things, but really it's all tied together. You can't have a setting without a place, and you can't have a setting without people, or even a place that has a lack of people, and that's going to be noticed, because if you know, like here on Earth, there's very few places that don't have anybody living in them. Usually people are, even if they are more third world, not overly technology-based people, and they're still back in their hunting days or whatever, then there's still people there. So people are important to the setting because people are everywhere. You can't have a place without people in them. Well, or it's going to be a significant lack of people. So yes, technically you can have no people, but there's going to be a reason for that. And that's going to change the setting up appropriately. A setting with people versus a setting with no people is going to look completely different. So it's very tied to the setting. And the things, because without people, or with people, you have things. So things are very important because different things are going to happen in different places with different people. See, it's all coming together now. See, it's all linked together to make setting. All right. A couple more. It is also important in a setting to have a distinction between places. So this kind of goes along with people and place and things. We need a distinction between the different places because, as we mentioned before, setting, not every place is the same. So we need to have a clear distinction of we're here, or we're here, or we're here, or we're here, or where are we? There needs to be a clear, what's the word I'm looking for? A clear marker, a clear distinction, clear something that we are in this place. And then when you move your characters or have them go somewhere else, that you are in a different place with different people and different things and different places. Because you don't want it to get too meshed up into where people don't know where they're at or what they're doing at this place or why they had to go from point A to point B if it's basically the same place or a very similar place. It's also important because to develop setting, to develop these different areas that we're at, you have to have a distinct difference between the items. You have to be able to build that up and to be able to get to a place, to get to somewhere that somebody can identify. Really hope that made sense. Let me know if it didn't. So that one's kind of a really quick one. It kind of relates to the other things we've been talking about. Going to different places means different people, places, and things, and creatures, and so we need to distinguish exactly where we're at when the characters get there. Otherwise, your reader is going to be lost. Okay, and then the last main thing that is important to involve in a setting, is that characters are hindered or helped by their environment. So, say someone your character gets kidnapped. Their environment, or wherever they get taken to and kidnapped to, is going to either help them. It's either going to have elements that will help them, or it's going to have elements that will hinder them from escaping. And that is going to matter based on where they're at. So, characters are going to be hindered or helped or interact with this environment, and it's going to change the outcome of what can happen. Same thing with just interacting normally. If you go to a town and there's a marketplace, the character might interact with the people at that marketplace or buy some things or whatever else. So it's very characters are going to interact with your environment. It's going to interact with the setting, and the setting is going to delineate. Is that the right word? Delineate what a character can or cannot do, depending on where they're at. Because either the environment has it or it doesn't have it. It'll either help them or it'll hinder them, depending on what you're having your character do and where they're at. So that's another thing that's going to be involved with setting, and it's important to keep in mind when you've got setting. So if you're going to take your character to be kidnapped and they're going to be stored in a cell, that's going to change what kind of escape options they have. You can't just have them, they're in a cell, they're not going to have, like rope just handy in their cell in order for them to climb up to a vent or something like that. Depending on, I know you're probably thinking like what cell is going to have a vent. But it's kind of hard to make things up right on the top of my mind here. Or if you're going to have them be kept in a like place that's very Arctic or whatever. You're not gonna have like, you're gonna be slipping and sliding on the ice as they're trying to get away. They're not gonna just be able to run across, and it's gonna be grassy outside. So it's gonna have different things that's going to manipulate or what's available for your character to do or don't do. It's going to change what story you're able to write based on what setting you put them in. So if you want them to be swinging from vines in the jungle, you're not going to put them in a plain where there's no trees. That might seem kind of obvious, but I just mean, like, I'm trying to show how much interacting with the environment is important and how setting is important when thinking about how your character will interact with it and what kind of opportunities you're going to give your character in this place. Okay, so those are all the elements that I felt like were really important to keep in mind when writing setting, and how setting is important to the whole story, and what kind of things are based off of setting and are important to understand when writing a setting. Again, other videos, I'll go ahead and talk more about individual things like creatures and monsters, or building a place, or how to describe environments. Those kind of things we will be able to talk more in depth on later videos.